So thank you so much. As Maya mentioned, this talk is not going to be super long, and we've got lots of time. I'll be talking with David, but we'll also have time for your questions. So I hope that you all feel utterly welcome to share anything that's on your mind during that time. Let's jump in. This is Margaret Mead. She was one of the most famous anthropologists in history. She traveled the world studying cultures, both modern, that are around now, and ancient, through the study of fossil evidence, for instance. And at one point, somebody asked her, they said, Dr. Mead, what is the first archaeological sign of human civilization? What do a group of people leave behind that suggests they weren't only a group of people, but that they had truly human culture? And they thought that she might say, well, it's an arrowhead or a shard of pottery. Maybe it's the things that we make that make us human. But instead, she said the first sign of human civilization is a femur, a thigh bone, that is broken and then healed. Why would that be? Well, in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, that's a fatal injury. You might not die right away, but you won't be able to find food or shelter. You might become prey for larger animals, or prey for smaller animals, which frankly sounds even worse, right? The idea, though, is that if you see a femur that is broken and then healed, that somebody else cared for you. Maybe they even risked their life to save yours. And it's that capacity to be there for one another that Margaret Mead thought was the truly first sign of human civilization. And I think she's right. I mean, look at us. We are not that physically, I'm not to insult anybody here, but just as a species, we are not that physically impressive. We are medium-sized mammals. We're pretty mediocre swimmers. We're not very fast runners. We can't fly. Really, our only chance is each other. And we have taken advantage of that chance. Despite what you might read in the news, human beings are by far the world champions of kindness. We help one another on a scale unseen in the animal kingdom. But what allows us to do that? There's lots of ingredients to this recipe, but one might emerge when you watch somebody walk across the Grand Canyon. Now, we, of course, are standing or sitting on solid ground in no danger of plummeting to our doom. But if you're anything like me, just looking at this video, you might feel your palms start to sweat. You might feel a little bit nervous, as though it were you, not him, on the wire. If you are going through that, that is one flavor of empathy, a word for our emotional connections to one another. Empathy is a simple word, but a complex idea, so I want to get to definitions right away. As psychologists like me see it, empathy is not one thing, but rather represents three ways that we respond to what other people are experiencing, and in particular, what they're feeling. The first is when we vicariously catch or share somebody else's emotions, which we call emotional empathy. The second is our attempt to understand what other people feel and why. And the third is our tendency to care about other people, to wish for their well-being to improve, which we call empathic concern or compassion. Now, these three pieces make up the full range of human empathy. And you can think of the empathy in a person or in a community like UCLA as a human natural resource. And if it is a precious one. At this point, decades of science show us that empathy helps everybody involved. Empathic versus less empathic individuals report being happier and less depressed. They form stronger and happier relationships, and they tend to do better in their work if their work involves people, which is like all work, so that's a good thing. Empathy helps the people around us. Patients of empathic doctors are happier with their care. Employees of empathic bosses are more satisfied in their work. And spouses of empathic partners tend to be more satisfied in their marriages, which is probably not the most surprising thing you'll hear today. But empathy is not just useful for connecting us with the people in our lives, it's maybe even more useful for stitching together broader communities. When we encounter strangers, through empathy, we're more likely to help them, for instance, donating to charity or volunteering, and we're less likely to see them through the lenses of stereotyping, prejudice, and bias. In other words, empathy helps us do all the things that Margaret Mead knew we needed to do to thrive as a species. Which is great. right? I mean, we've got on our side this ancient instinctive engine for connection, kindness, collaboration, cooperation, all of those great words that for some reason start with C. That's great. But, so that must mean then, if we, this empathic animal, have taken over the whole planet, that we must then be living in a golden age of social harmony, all sitting together in a global circle, holding, no, I can't even get through the sentence. Of course we don't. These are really difficult times, and they're hard times for empathy as well. Because empathy is not our only ancient, instinctive view of human nature or response to other people. Another is our tendency to split the world into social categories, and in particular, groups that we belong to, or us, and groups that we don't belong to, or them. And there's nothing wrong with that. We are different. That's part of what makes us great. The problem is when groups come into conflict, which is when empathy disappears. One place that we see this, of course, now is ideological and political division in the US and beyond. In those escalating conflicts, what we find is that over the last 50 years, Americans, for instance, we disagree more than we used to, but we also dislike the people that we disagree with much more than we did even 20 or 30 years ago. That's what's known as emotional polarization. And when emotional polarization rises, empathy doesn't just disappear, it's replaced with schadenfreude. This is the experience of actually enjoying the suffering of somebody you dislike. I think all too often, our politics, our ideological world has become a schadenfreude buffet. It's easy to find people who seem like they're less interested in advancing their own cause and more interested in actually causing pain to people that they disagree with, people who they feel different from. Now, none of this is new, but it's getting worse. And part of the reason for that is the way that we interact. Far less often in person, like we're doing now, and more often over giant social media platforms. Now, there's a couple of reasons that those settings are not great for empathy. One is what we lose online. Here in this room, we can see each other's faces, hear each other's voices. It's obvious that we are interacting with human beings. Online, those cues often disappear, replaced with anonymous avatars and strings of text. It's easier to forget that the person we are interacting with is a person at all. On social media, we are also often encouraged to be the least empathic version of ourselves. Research conducted on Twitter finds that when people tweet in outrage, typically at people who they disagree with, they are rewarded with likes and retweets from people who are already on their side. Egged on in this way, they tend to post even more outrage and anger to the other side, escalating conflict over and over again. So this is a problem. Empathy could serve us. It could serve our goals as a species, but it often runs dry just when we need it the most, when we encounter each other across difference and when we feel separated from one another. So can we do anything about this? Does it have to be this way, or can we reclaim our empathy and our common humanity even and especially when things are difficult? I think that the way you answer that question redounds to how you answer an even more basic question, which is, can we control our empathy at all? And for the longest time, the answer was no, not really, because people tended to view empathy as a trait. The idea was that each one of us has some level of empathy, and we're stuck there for life. Now, if empathy comes naturally to you, this is great news, but if you struggle with it, this is terrible news, because it means that no matter what you do or how hard you try, you'll never get better at connecting with people. I think it's even worse news for all of us, because it means that as conflict escalates, there's nothing that we can do to overcome that either, to reclaim empathy in the face of these difficult situations. So this is a pretty bleak view, but thankfully it's also wrong. It turns out that my lab and many others have now documented lots of evidence that empathy is less like a trait and more like a skill. Some people are born more empathic than others. That's true. You're not going to turn Hannibal Lecter into Mother Teresa overnight. But our experiences matter. Some can weaken our empathy, cause it to atrophy, and others can cause it to strengthen and grow like a muscle, And crucially, that means that through the right habits, hello, I'm going to try to not speak too loudly, but also not too quietly, because I don't want to bore you. So I'm going to try to keep my volume right here. Should be easy. Again, through the right habits, we can build our empathy on purpose like we would work out a muscle. My lab and I often talk about our research as building empathy gyms for people, places that they can go to practice their care and understanding when they want to. And I want to offer you 3 ideas from our work. For each one, I'll give you the headline first, and then I'll tell you about the science that we've done to support it. The first is that simply knowing that we can build empathy is a first step towards doing so. One of my favorite colleagues at Stanford is Carol Dweck. Maybe some of you know her for her work on mindsets. These are beliefs about ourselves that change how we face challenges. Most famously, Carol has found that when people believe that they can't get any smarter no matter what they do, they shy away from difficult intellectual problems because they figure, why bother? It's not going to help me. When they know instead that intelligence is a skill, which it is by the way, then they're more likely to embrace those difficulties and try to grow, and actually to grow as a result. When I got to Stanford, Carol and I decided to see what people's mindsets were around empathy. We started just by asking them, for instance, which of these 2 statements they agreed with. People can or cannot change how empathic a person they are. And we found that people were split right down the middle. About 50% here on the left thought of empathy as a fixed trait that you can't change, and about 50% here on the right viewed it as a skill that you can. And we thought, well, shoot, if folks are so undecided about this, maybe we can change their mind. So in a set of experiments, we presented people with one of 2 essays. Some people read this essay. Empathy, like plaster, is pretty stable over time, meant to make them see it as a fixed trait. Other people read this essay. Empathy is changeable and can be developed, meant to make them see it as a skill. Hopefully this is making sense to you, right? We're trying to change people's opinions about the nature of empathy itself. And after this, we put all of these folks through an empathy obstacle course, full of situations in which it doesn't always come naturally to connect with other people. And over again, we found that people who had just learned that empathy was a skill worked harder at it. For instance, they spent more time listening to stories told by somebody who was a different race from themselves. And they spent more effort trying to understand the opinions of someone they disagreed with politically, which is like a minor miracle these days. In other words, when we taught people that they could build their empathy, they were more likely to try to do so. Now, to Carol and to me, this is an optimistic finding, but it's also a little bit ironic. You know, I just told you that 50% of the population views empathy as a fixed trait. There is a 50% chance that before engaging with my work, you thought that. And if you did, that's perfectly understandable. People change super slowly, and it's easy to forget that we change at all. But we do. In fact, the only thing that you can't do as a person is to stop changing. If there's one message from my work, I hope it's one of empowerment. We are all works in progress, but by knowing that and acknowledging that, we can set goals for who we want to be and hopefully get better at connecting in the process. Okay, the second message from my work that I want to share is that care is contagious. Because really, everything about human behavior is contagious. We are not a solo species. We are a herd species. Right? We do and say and think and feel what the people around us do. In other words, we conform. And conformity gets a bad rap. For instance, if peer pressure causes you to do something that harms you or somebody else. But conformity can also be a force for good. People are more likely to donate to charity, conserve energy, and vote when they learn that others around them are doing those same things. And in my lab, we found that people are also more likely to act empathically if they believe that people around them are empathic, which is great news, except it turns out that we systematically underestimate how much other people care. This is true at Stanford as well. A couple of years ago, my lab surveyed thousands of Stanford undergraduates and asked them questions about themselves and about the average student. For instance, how likely are you or the average student to empathize with someone who feels bad? How much do you or the average student enjoy meeting other students? And we discovered not one, but 2 Stanfords. The first, here in orange, was made up of real students who were enormously warm and kind and compassionate, and who desperately wanted to connect with one another. The second Stanford, here in blue, lived in students' minds, and it was a colder, pricklier place. Students vastly underestimated how friendly and warm their peers were and didn't know how much their peers wanted to connect with them. Those misperceptions didn't stay in students' heads. Students who underestimated each other, who thought least of each other, also asked least of each other. They were less likely to strike up conversations with classmates or to confide in their dorm mates when they were struggling. And they ended up lonelier and less mentally healthy over the next year, their first year in college. And we thought, this is a tragedy. Students all over our campus want to befriend each other. They want to spend time together, but they're not trying to connect because they don't know that that's what everybody else wants too. I strongly believe that social connection is like psychological nourishment, keeping us healthy, keeping us alive in many cases. And if that's true, then these students were starving in the middle of an organic grocery store, unaware of all the resources available to them. And so we tried to change that. Last year, we started an ad campaign where the target audience is Stanford undergraduates, and the product is also Stanford undergraduates. We targeted certain dorms and put posters up in those dorms, simply showing students the truth about themselves. So for instance, 95% of Stanford students are likely to help others who are feeling down. 85% enjoy meeting and becoming friends with students they don't know. If these flyers look like they're Christmas coded, let me explain. Stanford, our color is cardinal red, and our mascot is, for some reason, a tree. So just to be clear, this is not only for the holidays. This is perennial and year-round. And what we found is that students who learned this information about each other were less likely to underestimate how empathic their peers were and more willing to take chances on them, to try to connect, to empathize with their peers, and to request empathy from them in response. And over the next 6 months, these students then ended up with stronger and broader social networks, more people who they felt connected to, and they ended up less lonely as well. And what I love about this work is that all you have to do to build greater connection is not to lie to students, but simply to tell them the truth. I want to share one more insight from my own work, and then we'll move to conversation. And that's the idea that empathy is a powerful tool when we think it is. And here I want to return to maybe one of the least empathic, most depressing spaces in our culture, which is ideological and political division. Again, it is no secret that we are more divided than we were in the past, that we like each other less than we did in years and decades past, but we also spend far less time than we used to with people we disagree with. We have sorted, so we are less likely to live and work with people who have different opinions from ourselves, and when we do encounter them, we try to leave as soon as possible. We try to avoid those conversations. One of my favorite studies on this occurred during Thanksgiving 2016. Now, you might remember something else also had occurred in November of 2016 that maybe made that Thanksgiving a little bit more fraught than usual. So scientists used geotagging on people's phones to see where they went to Thanksgiving dinner. And they found that people who crossed party lines, going from a majority Democratic county to a majority Republican one, or vice versa, for their Thanksgiving dinner, left that dinner almost an hour earlier than people who had dinner in a county that agreed with their politics. Now, I want to be clear. The last hour of Thanksgiving dinner is when you have pie. So these people forsaking pie, that is commitment to not talking across difference. And when we commit that way to not having dialogue, what happens? An information vacuum grows. We stop really knowing what the people we disagree with are like because we don't spend time with them. Well, guess who's happy to fill that information vacuum? Media sources, cable news, social media, you name it. And they fill it systematically with the most frightening and off-putting information about the other side as they can. And what that leads to is a situation where we have very warped views of what the other side is like. In my lab and many others, researchers have asked people to imagine the average person you disagree with, a Republican if you're a Democrat if you're a Republican, and say, well, what is that person like? And again, lots of studies find that we are wrong about each other in virtually every way we can measure. People believe that the average person they disagree with is far more extreme than they really are. They think that that average person is twice as hateful as they really are, twice as anti-democratic as they really are, and 4 times as violent as they really are. Now, if you believe that about the quote-unquote other side, why would you ever enter dialogue with them? Of course you wouldn't. You would think that they're monsters and you'd try to avoid them. You would leave Thanksgiving dinner 2 hours early, potentially, right? I'm going to argue now that those conversations are much more useful than we think. But I want to be clear about what I'm not arguing. I'm not saying that we owe people our empathy if they are directly threatening us. I'm not saying that we need to dialogue with people who would take away our basic human rights. But I am saying that oftentimes I think we overestimate how much the other side actually wants those things. And I do think that conversations are useful, in part because in the lab, we've forced people to have them. We really have. I mean, they consented, but then we did force them to have conversations. In a recent study, we brought about a little over 100 Americans, half Republicans, half Democrats, into Zoom conversations where they talked about climate change, abortion, and gun control. Easy, no problem. And we asked these people before the conversation, how do you think it's going to go on a scale of 1, very negative, to 100, extremely positive? And people guessed that these conversations would be somewhere between neutral and awful, right? They kind of said, I'm not going to like this person, it's going to be an unpleasant experience, and they further thought that after the conversation, they would dislike the other side more than they already did, presumably because of how badly this would go. You know who else thought that these conversations would go badly? We did, the researchers. Even though we were doing this study to presumably see if conversations could be useful, we were terrified. We trained a bunch of research assistants Talmudically in what they should do, not if, but when people started yelling at each other, or threatening each other, or doxing each other. We predicted that 25% of these conversations would have to be stopped for reasons of incivility. Does anyone want to guess what percentage were actually stopped? 0. I kind of made that easy. I sort of teed that up for you. But yes, thank you. 0% of these conversations had to be stopped. And afterwards, we asked these folks, how did the conversation go on that same 1 to 100 scale? And the most common response we got was a 100 out of 100. People found these conversations to be delightful, shockingly so, because they were totally wrong about who was on the other side. Here I'll show you what people expected of the person who they disagreed with in blue and what they actually found that person to be like in orange. And you can see that people vastly underestimated how open, logical, and empathic this other person would be, and vastly overestimated how angry they would be. So people were wrong about the folks they disagreed with, they were wrong about what those conversations were like, and they realized that they were wrong. Afterwards, they felt more intellectually humble, more open to other perspectives, and they disliked the other side less. And that effect lasted at least 3 months. So one conversation across difference decreased animosity 3 months later. I think because these are so rare, and because when we have these conversations, we realize how wrong we have been, often, not always. So I think that these conversations are not just nice, however, they're also powerful. Research in political science finds that the best way to persuade people of a political point is not to browbeat them with facts until they succumb in some sort of, I don't know, verbal MMA, but instead to have open and vulnerable conversations with them. The punchline here is that if you want somebody to listen to you, one of the best things you can do is show that you're listening to them first. In other words, empathy is a strength, not a weakness, in conversations and dialogues across difference. The problem is that people don't really know that. And so in the last experiment that I'll tell you about, we decided to change what people thought about empathy and see if that changed how they engaged in these dialogues. So in an experiment very similar to the one I just told you about with Carol Dweck, we had 1,000 Americans, 500 Republicans, and 500 Democrats read one of 2 essays. Some of them read this essay, Is Empathy Overrated?, where they learned some bad news. They learned that empathy can impede our judgments and make us worse negotiators. This is not true. I just want to be We were lying to people, but we told them afterwards, hey, just so you know, this is not true. But before we told them the truth, we asked these people who had just learned that empathy was a weakness to write a note about a very contentious issue, gun control, to somebody that they disagreed with. So if you're a Democrat, you're writing to a Republican, and vice versa. I'm going to play voice actors reading some of those notes to you now. Here is a Democrat writing to a Republican, and hopefully you can hear this.
It's hard not to state this bluntly. You should be in favor of stricter gun laws because you should care about the lives of other people more than your outdated feelings of machismo.
Okay, and here's a Republican writing to a Democrat.
People need to know they are able to have the freedom to bear arms in order to protect themselves. You Democrats don't get to take that away from us.
We recreated Twitter, everybody, and we are very sorry. We did not mean to do that at all. People were really rude. After learning that empathy was a weakness, they invoked partisan identities, they insulted one another. There were many notes that I could not have voice actors read for you good people today, put it that way. But other people in our study instead read a different essay. This one, Is Empathy Underrated?, where they learned the truth, that actually empathy can enhance our judgments and make us better negotiators. And again, we asked these folks, who were different than the ones who had read the other essay, to write a note about gun control to someone they disagreed with. I'll play you just one of those from a Democrat writing to a Republican now.
There are some common sense regulations that we should implement to keep people safe. We all want what is best for the country, and there are things we can meet in the middle on to tackle the issue of gun violence.
Do you all see the difference here? Yeah, and lest you think I was cherry picking, linguistic analyses found that there were systematic differences in what people wrote and the way that they wrote. Upon learning that empathy was a strength, would help them be better negotiators, folks talked in completely different ways. Instead of appealing to partisan identities, they appealed to common American values. Instead of attacking the other person, they tried to connect with the person on the other side of the disagreement. And these notes were not just nicer, they were more effective. We sent all 1,000 of these notes to readers who really disagreed with the writer on the issue of gun control. So if the note was written by a Democrat, we sent it to a Republican, and vice versa. And we asked them, hey, how persuaded are you by this message? And we found that writers who had just read this positive message about empathy as a strength wrote notes that were more persuasive to people that they actually disagreed with than people who had just read that empathy was a weakness. In other words, when we taught people that empathy was useful, they used it, and it became useful. Which brings me to a broader message of really all of my work, which is that our beliefs are not just beliefs. They are self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And that includes our beliefs around empathy. If you think that you can never change in terms of how caring or connected you are less likely to try, and you are less likely to actually change. If you think that empathy is deeply unpopular in your community, you're less likely to try to express it or to seek it from others. And if you think that empathy is a weakness in difficult situations, you might avoid those situations and never learn about people who are different from yourself. But the opposite is also true. If you know that empathy is a skill, you might invest more in your personal growth and grow as a result. If you know how popular empathy is in your community, you might feel peer permission to express those deeper values. And if you know that empathy is a strength, you might approach even difficult conversations with a more hopeful eye. I hope that we can change our beliefs around empathy and gravitate towards a truer, more scientific, and I would argue more hopeful view, which is that empathy is exactly what Margaret Mead knew, the secret to our species' success. That's it for me for now. Really looking forward to the conversation and to your questions. Thank you for your time.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. Let me introduce myself. I'm David Myers. I teach in the Department of History and direct the Bedari Kindness Institute, and am faculty director of the Dialogue Across Difference Initiative. So, how many people have read the book, The War for Kindness? Okay, great to know. So I want to begin by asking you, Jamil, something about yourself and your professional sense of self. you're a social psychologist. Are you also a social engineer? Meaning, do you not just study how the mind works, but do you attempt to alter it as part of your regular practice?
That's a really deep question. I would say that the answer to that has changed. When I started studying empathy, it was really more out of curiosity than a desire to change anything. I was mostly interested in how empathy worked in the brain. So, for the first, 10 years of my career, I was mostly focused on just understanding. What is it and what does it do for us? I guess even I had a little bit more of a trait-like view of empathy when I started. So I didn't really think of investing in change because I didn't think that people could change very much. And it was only through my study and work that I started to realize that actually, no, we can build empathy, we can shift it. And when the research brought me to that point, there was a greater sense of urgency, I suppose, that developed in my work, where I said, well, wait a minute, if we can change, and if psychology can give us some tools through which to enact that change, well, who am I to just study this? I should really try to make a difference if I can. And I'd say that the sort of momentum of my own work and that of my lab has shifted to much more applied stuff in the last probably 5 to 8 years.
What are some of those tools that can affect that kind of change? And what, I suppose, are the limits upon moral and otherwise, upon your attempt to alter attitudes and behaviors?
Well, I mean, I think that it's very hard to change people if they don't want to change. And certainly I'm not in this business to try to force people to be somebody who they don't want to be. I think that your microphone is, yeah.
A little bit higher. Okay.
Great.
How's that?
But I think one thing that I've learned is that actually, if you survey people, like we did at Stanford, they want empathy to be a bigger part of their lives. People, even in conflict, I mean, the US is one example. We are super polarized, but if you survey Americans, 80% of them, Republicans and Democrats, wish that we were less polarized and that we could connect more across difference. So I think that this is...
You accept the sincerity of that assertion?
I do. I think that we, in our...
Why?
Well, I tend to believe people. As a psychologist, I think you ask people about themselves and you're asking them anonymously. It doesn't seem like they have that much reason to lie. Maybe they have an inflated sense of self and they think that they want something but don't act that way. I would say, though, that I do think that when you get people in conversations, when you get people in situations where they're actually confronted with another human being as opposed to doom scrolling or feeling the ambient sense of threat that we are saturated with in our culture, they do genuinely want to connect. I think that partially I believe people because I do think that this is a fundamental human desire and a fundamental human capacity.
Okay, I want to go back. Maria, are you hearing me okay? Yes. Great. So I want to just go back to sort of basic definitions. Your book is entitled The War for Kindness, and you spent a lot of time tonight talking about empathy.
Yeah. So
I wonder if you could help delineate the boundaries or the porousness, perhaps, between kindness and empathy, and maybe add something that's of interest to me for my own scholarly reasons, altruism. How do you understand these three as part of a cluster?
Yeah, empathy is an experience, and kindness is a behavior, right? So empathy is our sense of connection, our psychological sense of connection to the experiences of other people. Kindness is any action that one person takes that benefits another person. And of course, an experience and an action are not the same thing. You can be kind to somebody without feeling any empathy for them. I don't know if anybody has ever helped a friend move out of a sense of obligation, and then you show up and they haven't even packed. And you're like, what? I have to pack for you as well? That's one instance where you act kindly, maybe without so much, maybe that's just me. I'm like processing trauma here. And you can also feel immense empathy and not do anything, right? I think that that's actually been a huge issue when it comes to burnout and burnout from modern media. We encounter so many problems every day that we can't do anything about. And so that separation between empathy and kindness can actually be quite corrosive. Just to your question, altruism is a subset of kindness, at least as far as I understand it, and I think evolutionary theorists and economists and psychologists understand it, would be that altruistic acts are acts of kindness that don't also benefit yourself. Right? If you act kindly, but if you donate to charity and you get a tax break, and you do it in order to get a tax break. If you help a friend, but it's because you hope that they do a favor for you later, that would be considered cooperation, an act that benefits them and you. Altruism is an act that is only designed to benefit somebody else, even if it comes at a cost to yourself. Jumping on a grenade to save your fellow soldiers being the sort of paradigm case of that. And whether altruism is real or not is as you probably know, a huge issue of debate in philosophy and in psychology.
Right. Do you want to just say a word about that?
Yeah.
Since you've titillated us with that.
A lot of people argue that every act that a human being does, it has to be selfish at some level, that there's no such thing as true altruism, because even if, let's say, you help somebody through the goodness of your heart, you're going to feel good about that later, either because you'll feel good that you acted in accordance with your values, or because seeing other people be happy makes us happy. And I've always thought that trying to act as though that is selfishness just dilates the definition of selfishness beyond meaning. To me, if we are biologically constructed such that we are so intertwined with one another that helping others is the same as helping ourselves, that's beautiful. I mean, and if you want to call that selfish, not you, Dave, but if somebody wants to call that selfishness, that's fine with me.
Okay, I want to sort of move down the definitional spectrum to another concept that you talk about at considerable length in the book, which we haven't spoken about today, but which has been hovering above the discussion, and that is hate. You talk a lot about hate and about sort of the contagion of hate. You talked in your presentation about sort of the contagion as a positive force multiplier.
Yeah.
But it can be, as we know, and often is, especially under current circumstances, a force multiplier for something at the opposite end of that emotion and behavioral spectrum. So how do you understand hate?
I mean, hatred is, hatred is ancient, as old as empathy. And from my perspective, it is intimately connected with a sense of threat. That really hatred is most natural when we feel as though our selves or our groups, the people that we care about, are threatened by another group. That's when really what evolution calls for is aggression. And hatred, as well as schadenfreude, are psychological paths to aggression and to violence. Right? The same way that empathy is a psychological path to kindness, hatred, fear, and threat are paths to these to very opposed behaviors. And as you're saying, I think that these states are all very contagious, and that's why it's so careful to mind the sort of currents in our culture. I personally feel that our media ecosystem especially is driving us very incessantly towards greater levels of hatred because of the ways that it misrepresents and over-represents the most threatening versions of people who are different from ourselves.
Right, so I suppose the historian would say, don't we dwell in a context in which the social forces are arrayed in such a way as to render difficult, if not impossible, the requisite conditions in which kindness and empathy can flourish? And they include those conditions, social media, right? And that affective polarization in our larger political culture that you made reference to.
Yeah.
So it seems very Sisyphean, like we're pushing a boulder up a hill.
Yeah.
And that boulder keeps coming down.
I think that's right. And Iran Halperin, this great psychologist in Israel who studies conflict in that part of the world, he has this great sort of analogy. He says that fighting hatred is like being on a treadmill. If you don't do anything, you won't stand still. You will move backwards, right? I think that these instincts for fear and division lie deep within us. I mean, I'm not here to just give us good news, right? I think that
even though you're the author of a book on hope for skeptics.
Yeah, that's true. Hope for cynics, yes.
Cynics.
Yeah, but again, I think the reason that I wrote that is because cynicism is our default in a way.
Right.
And I think that, oftentimes our default setting is one that is not healthy for us. I mean, think about sort of the way that we interact with our phones in ways that increase our anxiety, that we interact with social structures in ways that increase our division. So we have two choices in that space. One, we can say, well, it's just human nature, nothing to do about it, and give up.
Right.
That doesn't seem very productive, right? The other is to say,
The fatalist approach.
Yeah, exactly. The other is to say, well, yeah, this is hard. And many things that are worthwhile are also very hard to do.
I mean, this is what's so interesting about what you presented tonight and what you argue in the book, which is to say that kindness and empathy are acts of volition and malleable. You push back against what you call psychological fixism
Yeah.
in the name of mobilism, the ability to be malleable and to will oneself out of that default stance. That's a really powerful, even radical idea, right? I mean, it seems, at some level, it could seem Pollyannish.
Yeah.
Like if only we could will our way out of it. But you actually have research to stand behind your claims.
Well, it's not just me. I mean, I would say that the central message of both psychology and neuroscience over the last 50 to 100 years is that people are more changeable than we knew, than scientists knew, and I would say more changeable than we, just lay people, think that we are. Right? So there's this great study from Dan Gilbert on the end of, he calls it the end of history illusion. I'd be curious what you think about that as a historian, but Dan asked people at different ages 2 questions. 1, how similar are you to who you were 10 years ago? And 2, how similar are you to who you will be in 10 years? In fact, I invite everyone here to engage in that little thought experiment. Think of who you were 10 years ago. Do you feel like the same person as back then? Or do you feel like you're really different than you were back then? And maybe even, just thinking about yourself 10 years ago, make you cringe a little bit. I mean, I know it does for me, right? But then ask yourself, well, who will you be in 10 years? What Dan finds is that people enthusiastically disavow who they used to be, but they are convinced that they are done evolving, that they are the person who they will be 10 years from now. So a 40-year-old thinks that they're nothing like they were when they were 30, but they're everything like they will be when they're 50. But a 50-year-old thinks they're nothing like they were when they were 40. Right? I think that to some level, fixism, this sense that we are not changing, is actually something that we crave. We want to know who we are. That's why BuzzFeed personality quizzes are so popular. Right? We want to know who we are, and we want to be confident in who we are and who we will be. So sometimes I think embracing the idea of change, as you're saying, is radical because it's destabilizing. It can be scary to not know who you will be. But I think that's the only path towards very intentionally trying to chart our future, the future that we want to have, as opposed to just letting the forces of history and society act upon us.
And I suppose also maximizing our recognition of the utilitarian quality of empathy, which you point out in your book. Like, this can be of benefit to you. It can be instrumental to some other desired outcome.
That's right, yeah. I mean, I call this making the business case for empathy, right? And it's interesting because that's frankly what a lot of my work has been lately is telling people the truth that, hey, if you empathize, you're going to benefit in all these ways. You're going to be more connected with your friends. You're going to build a stronger social network. You'll be more persuasive. And frankly, I mean, just between us in this very small private conversation, just
everything will stay in this room.
Mic's off, David. Here.
Mine was off for half of the talk. So.
But I guess I feel mixed about that because I do think that empathy will carry all sorts of self-related benefits, but I also kind of just want to make the human case for empathy, that you should want this because it's good to care about other people, because that's what is not just good for you, that's what's good for the people in your life and what's broadly good for our species.
Yeah. Apropos what's good for our species, I want to ask you, how close to midnight are we in terms of our own capacity for self-destruction? And I ask that question because in your book, you quote philosopher Jeremy Rifkin, who asked, can we reach global empathy in time to avoid the collapse of civilization and save the Earth? Kind of doomsday-laden.
Yeah. So now I have to answer that question? Yeah. I put that in there not to answer it. I don't have an answer. I don't know. Look, I think it's very easy to feel a sense of doom these days. I think it's just, there's so many very frightening things happening, from climate change to sort of destabilizing of democracies around the world, to the looming horizon of AI, whatever that's going to do. I think it's a terrifying time. I also think that, well, and again, you would know this better than I, but there have been terrifying times throughout history. In fact, most times are terrifying, and a lot of people believe that they're living in the last days of the
They're
of,
the
of
last
humanity.
link in the chain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful essay in my field, which is Jewish history, by a great underappreciated thinker called The Ever-Dying People, in which he says Jews have repeatedly thought of themselves over and over again as the last link in the chain. We are the last generation,
Yeah.
over and over again. And in fact, that self-perception induces a certain degree of anxiety that can become generative or even regenerative.
Yeah,
That sort
yeah.
of impels one to create anew.
Yeah.
And say, we have to get going here.
Yeah, sometimes that anxiety is there for a reason, right? It's I think it was Oliver Berkman who said, anxiety is dirty fuel, but it's still fuel. You know, it will get you to do something. And so, yeah, I'm terrified, as I think are many people, but I also feel, and you know, maybe I'm biased because of the work that I do, but I feel the hunger for connection across our culture.
Right. I guess that's a key question that I want to sort of press on a bit, which is much of your research in psychology in general focuses on, say, the phenomenon of empathy or kindness in the individual. And you've called attention to the volitional and malleable nature, the mobilist quality that we should aspire to, how we can tune that through acts of volition, through training. How do we scale that up? Now, putting your hat back on as a social engineer, to the group, to the collective, in order to effect real societal change, if that is our outcome or desired outcome?
Yeah, I think it's a huge question. And I want to say that if we think at the level of the entire society, that question is very difficult to answer, because really, society is not one thing. It is a vast collection of communities. And so from my perspective, if we are to socially engineer such that we can increase connection in cultures, I'm not saying to homogenize them. In fact, I think difference is great, but to connect people more deeply. If that was our goal, I would not say we're going to run an empathy intervention across the United States. I would say we should run it within our communities, and we should give people the tools to cultivate these skills within their community. I think that's what you all are doing beautifully here. I mean, the programs that you've run, the sort of Fiat Lux classes, it's just, again, I mean, I don't want to flatter you all too much, but it really is inspirational to me that you all are doing this. And from my perspective, there are two steps that are really important if a community is to build empathy. The first is to realize how much most people want that. I really do think that we are systematically wrong about each other. I think that people want empathy, but they don't realize that's what everybody else wants, so we all feel like we have to hide ours. It feels unsafe to be vulnerable if you don't think other people are going to accept that vulnerability or reciprocate it. So that's why at Stanford we've been running these basically psychoeducational campaigns where we teach students, again, the truth about what their fellow students want. In addition to that, I think it's great to create systematic opportunities for dialogue. And of course, I know that that's very much what you all do through your dialogue, through Difference program. But I think that oftentimes, one thing that I would love to do at Stanford, and I think really could be done at any community, a workplace, a town, a high school, a middle school, is to have a period very early in the year, whether it's a fiscal year or an academic year, where you basically create space and time for conversations. You say, we're not going to run our regularly scheduled program. Instead, we're going to bring people together, and you are going to talk about deep issues in your life. There's this program called the 36 questions that we use at Stanford, these like prompts that get people to know each other better. And when you get people to have those experiences with one another, it's a corrective, because they realize, just like folks in our Zoom study did, that the person that I'm speaking with is not what I expected. They're much more connected, much more open-minded, and much warmer than I think. So I think, again, creating that sense of common shared values and then giving people a chance to act on those values is a two-step that I encourage.
Which seems to me so very important to highlight, especially in the face of such powerful countervailing headwinds at the national, international level, which is think local.
Yes.
Think local. Think of your community. That can mean your dorm. That can mean your classroom. That can mean your university. That can mean your city or town. But this is where, in a certain sense, the revolution must start, from the bottom up.
I totally agree. And people feel much more hope when they think of their local communities. If you ask people, what is the state of the country or the world, you get really negative responses. If you ask people, what are people like, they answer that people are pretty selfish and untrustworthy. But if you ask people, what are the folks you regularly interact with like? Not just your friends, but your bus driver, your grocer, your neighbor. People are much more trusting and open to real people, which is both bad news and good news. It's bad news because we are encountering each other much more, not in real life, but in settings like social media that drive those negative stereotypes. But the good news is that the closer human beings get to each other, the more they like each other. That to me suggests that there's a
You are
chance.
a neo-Alportian in that
Yeah.
regard.
Yeah.
I'm referring to the great social psychologist Gordon Allport, who wrote in 1954 a famous book called The Nature of Prejudice, which basically argued for what came to be known as the contact theory. By engaging and interacting with people, you will reduce prejudice and bias.
Yep.
I know there have been ebbs and flows in the embrace of Allport and contact theory. Where are you at in that cycle?
Well, I mean, there's so much great work here, and I just want to shout out Salma Musa, who's a researcher here at UCLA who does fantastic work on contact.
In the political science department.
In political
Great.
science, yeah. And so, look, the idea is that when people get together with folks who are different from themselves, they will naturally feel less prejudice towards that group of people because that person will be a conduit for greater empathy and greater understanding. The status of this work is pretty strong, but it does not have a perfect track record. And one big challenge to contact theory recently is that generally when people come together across difference, it's not always on an egalitarian playing field. Sometimes one person comes from a group that has far less power than another. And typically when you have that sort of what's known as asymmetric contact, a couple of things can happen. One, the person or people in power feel great afterwards. They're like, oh, I have a chance now to think about this group of people that I don't think about too often. But people who are coming from a group that has less power do not feel as good. They think, yeah, I already knew the perspective of this powerful individual. I have to in order to survive in society. Another thing that can happen when you have asymmetric contact is that when people get along better, they might advocate less for their own needs, right? And that's especially important when there are power differentials. There's this concept of toxic harmony, that when people feel good about their connection to somebody in another group, they might stop engaging in social movements, for instance, to advocate for their own rights, which is probably not what we want. So contact can be very powerful, really helpful, but it's not perfect, just like no psychological intervention is.
Okay, just a program note. we're going to open up for questions in just a minute, but I'm going to ask maybe a question and a half before.
Sure.
You mentioned AI, and you live or operate in a domain of tremendous experimentation in artificial intelligence. That is, say, your home institution and its proximity to Silicon Valley. Can AI be a force for good in inculcating and fostering and promoting kindness? Do you see any way in which that can happen?
Yeah, I do. I'm neither a techno-optimist nor a doomer. I think that in the domain of empathy, there is massive risk when it comes to AI because AI can perform empathy without, of course, feeling it, right? So people report, for instance, so there's all these studies where people chat, they share something, a struggle that they're going through, and they get a response, and they don't know if that response is coming from a person or a chatbot. And generally speaking, people like responses from chatbots more. They find them to be more empathic, more helpful, and more caring. They don't like it when they know it comes from a chatbot. So the best support comes from a chatbot you think is a person, and the worst support comes from a person you think is a chatbot, which is, I think interesting. I think people have a lot to learn from that because we have certain systematic errors we make. We tend to butt in. So if you tell me, oh, my kid has strep throat, instead of asking you questions, I'll say, oh, well, my kid had the flu 2 weeks ago. It's an attempt to relate, but I'm really making the conversation about myself. AIs, because they don't have a self, don't do that, right? So I think we could learn from that. But I think there's a real risk that we could, in essence, commodify empathy. I mean, if you can talk to a chatbot with no risk, it can't reject you, it can't ghost you, it can't tell you that you're boring or self-centered, then we might turn that into a consumer experience where all we want is this frictionless, servile empathy, and human contact becomes too difficult. That's, to me, a very dystopic
It's not just
vision.
commodification, it's the sanitization of the human emotional experience.
Exactly,
Yeah.
yeah. And that to me is terrifying.
Yeah.
On the other side is the idea that AI might help us actually learn to connect more effectively with people. And I think this could be especially useful for folks who struggle with such connections. You know, so people with social anxiety, for instance, might practice with a chatbot, and that chatbot might then encourage them to connect with other human beings. Chatbots, I think, could also be useful as living diaries that help us realize that, hey, when you had that conversation that you were nervous about, it actually went great, right? So reminding us and maybe leading us to connect further. Now, again, I don't know which one of those is, probably both of them will happen to some degree, but I think that we need to be quite mindful of the way that we use these technologies socially and emotionally.
And is this something you're thinking a lot about, or it's kind of tangential to your research pursuits?
I'm the only person in San Francisco not working on AI, and I'd like to keep it that way. I happen to live 4 blocks.
Osmotically, though, it seems to have left an imprint.
I live 4 blocks from OpenAI, so it's hard not to think about it. People keep on asking me to work with these companies, but okay, well, another mic off moment. I have real trouble with this. You know, I think that the profit motive is so strong, and I think as a social scientist, one thing that I worry a lot about is being used to sort of empathy wash people's work. So I would gladly engage with one of these organizations if I thought that the research on human connection would actually materially change what they did. But I don't just want to be along for the ride. And thus far, and I'm not naming names here, but the organizations that have contacted me didn't seem like they actually were going to make concrete changes based on psychologists' recommendations.
Right. Okay, I'd like to now open up to the audience and invite you.
Oh my goodness.
Invite you to ask questions that you think are most urgent. I see one hand right there. Are we providing mics? I think not. So why don't you just stand up and or speak up and ask your question?
I really enjoyed your book. I didn't think I was going to like it. I was really bored, and I didn't want to study for midterms, so I picked it up and I read the whole thing. I really liked chapter 5 because, like, I work in healthcare, and it was really interesting when you started talking about over-empathy.
Yeah.
Because, like, for me, I'm a self-help addict, so I liked when you talked about how empathy helps you as, like, a person. Oh, you get more friends? That sounds awesome. I want more friends. But I want you to elaborate on, like, over-empathy and, like, the negative consequences of how do you find that balance between being empathetic but also being mindful of yourself?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah, so I think that, and thank you for the opportunity to clarify this. When I talk about working on empathy and building empathy, I do not mean empathizing as much as we possibly can with everybody all the time. I mean, can you imagine trying to walk, I don't know, through Midtown Manhattan while taking on the pain of everybody around you? I mean, you would collapse into a heap half a block in, right? And so I think that in balancing care for others and care for ourselves, I think there's a couple of points that I would draw on it, and that you know, are probably familiar from that chapter. The first is, I think that we really need to destigmatize self-compassion and to separate self-compassion from self-care. Right, so self-care is great. First of all, you know, definitely eat chocolate, have a bubble bath, watch Ted Lasso. Do it all at once if you want to. That sounds actually like a great evening, right? These are the activities that we engage in to separate ourselves from our suffering. Self-compassion is different. It is a mindful awareness of our suffering, right? It is meeting suffering head on in ourselves, but doing so while acknowledging that suffering is part of what makes us human, and treating our own suffering with kindness. So Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer are 2 of the great psychologists in this space, and they have all of these terrific 10-minute YouTube meditations that you can do. I do them all the time. I need them all the time. And so that's, I think, critically important. In high-achieving settings, we've found in my lab that people often imagine that self-compassion is a form of weakness or self-indulgence. And if you believe that, in our research, we find that you use self-compassion less, And actually, that hurts your ability to achieve, because it turns out that when you fail, it's critical to be able to bounce back from that failure and keep on trying, and self-compassion is one tool for doing so. So we find that people who worry too much that self-compassion will take them out of their grind set actually end up not grinding, not grinding as hard, because they perseverate and ruminate on their failures, right? So I think one piece here is to advocate and to reclaim the power of self-compassion. And then the other is, I think, to tune our empathy. You know, I shared earlier that there are 3 flavors of empathy, and one of these is taking on other people's emotions. I think a lot of people think that in order to be caring, they need to feel what other people feel, that that's what it means to be a good empathizer. But it's not necessarily. First of all, that's the fastest path towards burnout. So of the 3 pieces of empathy, that emotional empathy leads to burnout the most quickly. Second, it's the least appreciated by other people in many settings, right? So if I'm with my therapist and he starts crying and he's like, my God, your life really is terrible, right? That's not what I need. I don't need him to feel what I'm feeling. I need him to show me a new path, right? To experience compassion for what I'm going through, to understand me, but maybe not to share what I'm feeling. So I think that tuning our empathy away sometimes from that emotion sharing, where you're really taking on other people's pain, and towards a more sort of care with boundaries, I think is another tool that we can use there. Yeah,
And knowing we have the capacity to do so, to do that tuning. I think you had a question, Maya, right here. The microphone is going to come your way.
Hi, Dr. Zaki. I really enjoy your talk. I haven't read your book yet, but I will. Yeah. So I think I have some question. I have 2 questions. So one question is, I really enjoy like how you study this topic in different paradigm, and like you show how it can be changed. But I wonder, like, before like those interventions, like how do people, for example, how do young children develop the empathy? Like what's the developmental trajectory? And my second question is, a lot of your study sample, they are like Stanford University student, and I guess like their experience cannot really generalizable to large population, especially when we consider like more broad like cultural difference. For example, like the Western culture is more individualism versus the Eastern culture is collectivism. So how do you think about like the role of the cultural in how people perceive and learn empathy?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. Terrific. So developmental trajectories, generally speaking, emotional empathy, this sharing of other people's feelings, develops earliest in kids. 6-week-old infants will cry when another infant cries, but won't cry if they hear a noise that's just as loud and has similar frequencies, but not another baby crying. Cognitive empathy and compassion tend to develop later. They come online. I think compassion sort of comes online somewhere between 1 and 3 years of age, and cognitive empathy comes online last. I mean, it depends on how you measure it, but generally speaking, cognitive empathy is thought to develop somewhere around the age of 4. Now, that's the standard developmental trajectory. Of course, that differs depending on, people who have different sort of developmental trajectories or differences from one another, and it differs based on your environment. So people who are raised in very warm households where sort of parents express a lot of emotion and make efforts to connect tend to develop more empathy. And you might say, well, that's just because those kids are genetically predisposed to be empathic and their parents are too, but this is also true of children who are not genetically related to the people who are raising them, right? So the environment matters as well. To your question about cultural differences, you're right. I would, of course, would never say that Stanford students would generalize to the population. At the risk of sounding defensive, we do a lot of work with non-Stanford folks. I mean, we've done work with middle schools around the Bay Area of varying socioeconomic status. Our political studies are conducted with nationally representative samples from all over the country. But, of course, even that is a US-centric approach. There is some evidence, although I will say it's relatively weak, that there are differences in empathic concern across cultures that track collectivism. That is, people in more collectivistic countries report having greater levels of empathic concern or care for others. But there are other findings that complicate that story. Without going into too much detail, I will say that there are some cases people in collectivistic cultures report greater parochial empathy. That is empathy for people in their own group, as compared to a more universal empathy, which tends to be at least self-reported more in individualistic cultures. But I wouldn't want to place massive bets on any of that work. I will say that the world of cross-cultural research on empathy is quite small and still, I think, speculative to some degree. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, question right here. Maya, second row.
You mentioned
Oh, can you wait, Mark, just for...
You mentioned social media is part of the problem. If you could run the social media companies and re-engineer them, what would you do to make them better in terms of empathy?
Oh gosh. I mean, what I would do would decrease their profit enormously, so it will never be done, you know. But I think that right now, what the content that is, basically these are built like casinos, right? They're built to addict. And what addicts us is whatever information we pay the most attention to. And human beings, I write about this a lot in my new book, human beings are negatively biased, right? We pay most attention to threatening information compared to positive information. And so if you are designing a media experience and you want people to spend as much time on that experience as possible, you will inundate them with as much negative and frightening information as you can, whatever makes them feel outraged and scared and hopeless. And that's exactly what these companies do. I mean, and it's not just social media, by the way. The rise in negative language in headlines in legacy media is breathtaking. The amount of anger in headlines is like twice as great as it was at the turn of the 21st century. The amount of fear is 1.5 times greater than it was 25 years ago. So we're being fed this type of information. So what would I do? I would balance it out. I would try to make it more accurate. I would basically turn off a lot of the boosting algorithms that these companies use and just try to let everyday voices rise to the surface. If I could further engineer social media, I would force every person to post once about something that they're thinking or feeling or doing that day, because it's not just that we're algorithmically boosting people who are producing more outrage, it's also that those people are unusually prolific on social media platforms. So I guess I would want to make social media more representative, both algorithmically and in terms of participation. And I think the odds of either of those things happening are 0. But it would be great, wouldn't it? Thanks.
Other questions? I do have a big question for you.
Sure.
I'm sort of circles back to a lot of what we were talking about and is philosophical at root. Do you believe in the goodness of the human condition?
An easy one.
Yeah.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, exactly. That's
I mean,
what we brought you here for.
I don't know. I don't know that I believe that people are good or bad, simply because I think that if psychology teaches us anything, it's that people are adaptive. That put in different circumstances, the same individual will do things that are beautiful or things that are terrible, which to me speaks to malleability, to the fact that really what we are is changeable. I will say, you know, and again, I read a lot about this in Hope for Cynics, but I will say that I think that the average person is better than the average person thinks they are. You know, I think that we systematically underestimate people's warmth, their open-mindedness, their trustworthiness, and their kindness. And there's a bunch of evidence that suggests that. So are people good? I don't know, but I think
that they're better.
They're better, yeah. They're better than we think.
Great. I want other questions?
I see one over here,
Oh,
yeah.
okay. I'm somewhat blinded over here, so it's not that we're ignoring this section.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy to listen to you both. I have 2 questions. The first, I confess I haven't read your book, but now I really want to. But I'm curious, if you were to recommend each of us do just one thing every day to sort of develop our empathy muscle, what that would be.
Oh, wow.
And then if you could answer this question first, because I feel like it's more negative. I don't mean to be a cynical person, but I am wondering, are the types of people that are more willing to participate in surveys and such, does that kind of maybe skew the data? Like, do we think that those are the type of people that are more likely to be warm and empathetic?
That's really interesting. So so there's a couple ways to answer that. So one is selection bias is real, right? So people who fill out your surveys might be different than the people who are not filling out your surveys. You can deal with that in a couple of different ways. So at Stanford, for instance, sometimes we will take a class or a dorm, and we will, in essence, pay people enough that all of them will take part in our surveys. We'll also do like lots of marketing for our surveys to try to get what we would call a complete sample. And in a complete sample, you can document misperceptions in a way that you can be more confident about, because you can say, we know what everybody here wants, and we know what they think everybody wants, and we know that they're wrong, right? But that's not a perfect solution, but it's one way to go about this. Another thing that I would say is that if you think that people who fill out surveys are non-representative, then they're, and that they're more positive, for instance, then them being systematically wrong and too negative about other people suggests that other people who aren't filling out our surveys are even more wrong, right? That the discrepancies are actually greater, not smaller. So selection bias might be causing us to be unduly conservative in our inferences. That's a little bit of a wonky answer, but it's one that resonates with me. Now, to your more practical question, which I love, what is one thing that we can do each day to connect more effectively? I'm afraid I'm going to give you two things instead of one. The first is, and it might sound a little bit hokey, but I really think it's true, is I think that it would be great to have one more conversation per day than we have, especially conversations that maybe don't come naturally to us. So the great psychologist at UChicago, Nick Epley, has all of these studies where he asks people to predict what it would be like to interact with somebody. So what would it be like to talk to a stranger on the bus on your way to work? What would it be like to thank somebody who has helped you who you haven't gotten a chance to thank yet, whether it's from a few days ago or a few years ago? What would it feel like if you offered support to somebody, asked somebody for a favor? And in every single case, people in essence say, that would suck. It would be terrible. It would be awkward, cringe. The person will put their headphones on. You know, my friend will kind of feel like they don't know what to say if I offer them gratitude, or they'll feel put out if I ask for a favor. And then Nick forces a separate group of people to actually do these things and then report back on what the experience is like. And in every case, these experiences are far more positive and fulfilling and connective than people realize they will be. He calls that under-sociality. We basically don't interact enough because we don't realize how good other people are and how good those interactions will be. So if I could offer a tip, it would be to have one interaction that you don't feel like having every day. That would be one thing. And then the other thing, which maybe we can call this one, but it's 1A and 1B. The other thing that I think is a really powerful and simple thing to do is to just ask more questions in conversations, to treat conversations a little bit more like you're trying to learn about the other person, a little bit more like you're interviewing them as opposed to just going back and forth. There's just abundant evidence that we don't ask each other enough questions, and when we ask questions, one example of this, my friend Charles Duhigg, he's a great writer. His father died a couple of years ago, and he said that people kept on saying, I'm so sorry for your loss, my condolences, may his memory be a blessing. And Charles said, you know what no one did? No one asked me what he was like, ever. And he was desperate to talk about his father, to share stories about his dad, not just to sit with the sadness of his loss, but to revisit his life. And so I think that we often don't ask each other enough questions. So that was a super long answer to a relatively concise
maybe
question.
Just to build on that, to tell and listen to stories.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
It's an important part of what you understand to be kind of a tool to ameliorate the harsher tendencies in the human condition.
Especially in disagreement. There's a bunch of research that finds that our tendency is to say, well, we're disagreeing because this person is just ignorant. And if they only knew the truth, they of course would agree with me. And we get into this mode of kind of trying to teach people the truth, which we of course know and they don't, which we think will be useful and actually comes off as just enormously condescending and becomes really counterproductive. There's evidence that if we instead engage in, as you're saying, David, storytelling and story requesting, right? Say, instead of saying, what do you think, say, how did you come to feel that way? And then sharing our stories, that's a much more productive way to disagree.
Yeah, we have a question here and here. That I see. And here. Okay, we have about 8 minutes, so let's start here.
Speed round.
You know what? Why don't we take all of the questions, the 3 questions, and we will test Dr. Zaki's powers of memory. I'll make sure to write down the questions, but that way we'll make sure everybody's heard.
Great.
Okay, sounds great. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Zaki, for the great talk. And then if you don't mind, I would first like to add to your response to the previous question, and then I would like to ask you a question too. I'll try to be fast, I'm mindful of time. So responding to like the first question you said about like continuing conversation, and then I'm actually a PhD student working on communication and social neuroscience here at UCLA, and then building on the Nick Epley paper he was just referring to, we actually found that deep conversations can make strangers feel more connected with each other compared to shallow conversations. So like if you talk to each other about like what makes a perfect day for you, or like when's the last time you cried in front of a stranger, or like if there's a crystal ball that can tell you about future, what would you like to ask? Like things like that, rather than like, how's the weather today? That's gonna make people feel even better. Yeah. And then my question for Dr. Zaki is that like, how do you conceptualize loneliness, the loneliness pandemic with the empathy talk that you had today? Because we could imagine like lonely individuals feel more or less empathizing with the environment around them.
Yeah, okay, great. So that's question
let's hold
one.
on. That's question one. Where was the second question? Yeah, right there.
I know. Quick question about how you collect the data about like perception of how empathetic the other people might be and how empathetic they actually are. Because like, isn't it possible to say that them thinking how empathetic they might be, there is a projection of how empathetic they actually are too? Because wouldn't they say that I'm like, oh, I'm more empathetic to considerably nicer? And then my second question is, I think I'm also talked about over empathy and things like that. And then I ask you to elaborate more on the boundary setting, because when I'm not asking other people for a favor or anything, it's not necessarily because I don't think other people will be empathy, but I know that they might be going through a lot, like you mentioned, in this broken society, and then I can go without asking for those things, so I'm already being empathetic about how empathetic they might be, and I want to kind of prevent that situation, be that person to put more emotional like burden on them or things like that. So I want you to be kind of
thank you.
Elaborate more on the boundary setting.
So those are questions 2 and 3.
Yeah, we have a question right over there. Yeah. Our final question of the night.
As a creative writer, I've been really interested in the section of your book that talks about musical theater and how it can foster empathy, and also just the fact of taking on a different persona to kind of relive that experience, or even using VR to kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes. But you also talk about, because you're not actually living that experience, because you can take off the goggles, you can take off that persona, it's hard to really feel what they are feeling. So I was wondering, how effective do you think those kind of interventions are, and if so, should we participate in them regularly?
Yeah, thank you.
So we have about 3 minutes.
3 minutes, 4 questions. Okay. Loneliness. I think that oftentimes loneliness is associated, again, with an underperception of other people's empathy. I think that people generally want to connect, but oftentimes if they don't know that's what other people want, they avoid those connections. Undersociality, I think, is related to this. I think often undersociality, this idea of avoiding conversations, comes from a misperception of what other people want, which is related to your first question. Are we sure that the misperceptions lie in how we see other people, or could they lie in how we see ourselves? Maybe we're not wrong about other people being less empathic. Maybe we're wrong about ourselves. Maybe we're inflating our sense of how empathic we are. That's a very important question. We call it the ground truth problem. And there's, it's impossible to know for sure which one of these is true just based on survey data. But one piece of evidence in favor of the underestimate idea is what happens. So at Stanford, again, after people had reported on what they think the average Stanford student is like, we paired them up for conversations with strangers, with undergraduates who they didn't know. And we asked them to predict how empathic do you think that person will be, and then afterwards, how empathic was that person? And then, how empathic do you think the average Stanford student is? And what we find is that when you have an actual experience with another student, First of all, you admit that you underestimated them afterwards. You correct yourself, and that after having that conversation with strangers, you actually slightly enhance your view of what other people are like in general in the community. So that's one piece of evidence, not perfect, but one piece of suggestive evidence that it's not just inflation of the self. To your second question, well, what about if asking somebody else for a favor, maybe they want to help, but maybe they're overburdened? Well, one of the things that we find, and this gets back to the sort of business case for empathy, is that one of the best things for people who are stressed is to help other people, right? That's actually one of the fastest ways to improve our sense of self-efficacy, to improve our well-being. So the next time you ask somebody for a favor, make sure to tell them, you're welcome for the opportunity to help me, which is going to probably help you. No, but seriously, even and especially when people are struggling, helping others is one of the best things that they can do for themselves. And then the last question was about narrative art and other ways of entering into the perspective of other people from a distance. I totally agree with you that those entries from a distance are fleeting and limited, right? Reading a novel or writing one, going through a VR experience, gives you a sense that maybe you understand somebody, but maybe you don't actually understand them at all, and you've just gotten way overconfident. In my perspective, those types of interventions are great because they're scalable and because they're easy, but they're entirely incomplete. And what I would hope is that those interventions actually, what they do is develop a deeper curiosity in people and the desire to then connect with real other human beings who are different from them and engage in these sort of interview conversations where they can share and understand stories and get their empathy from the source as opposed to their own imagination alone.
That was an astounding feat of memory. Astounding. Characterized by exactly remarkable powers of synthesis and concision that animate this book, which I encourage you all to read. And I do so because I would like to ask that we leave tonight with serious thoughts about how we might operationalize some of what we've heard in our own local community. Precisely what Jamil was talking about, thinking local, thinking about that which we can do, that which is within our capacity to do. And here you can certainly avail yourself of the Dialogue Across Difference initiative and the Badari Kindness Institute. We have internship opportunities for students. The Dialogue Across Difference initiative has a new Bridge Builders Fund that provides resources to students who have ideas about how to build up their own skill set in engaging in dialogue, or have programs in mind about how to make their community more communicative across difference. So there are real opportunities, and there's a really urgent need, and really for inspiring us to think in so many creative ways, we are deeply in debt to Professor Jamil Zaki.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
This is delightful. Thank you so much.